Hi, Dr. Dave Webster. This is one of my ongoing series of videos on the travesty of Pattern, Ontario, and yet another case example of me having to say to a patient, "I'm so sorry you live in Ontario, otherwise things might have been differently." This is a patient who has had, chest x-rays over the years, and it showed that there was basically some scarring in the apex. Then in 2009, in August of 2009, this patient had a CT scan for this, and you can see with this red arrow here that this is on the left lung, and this shouldn't be here. This is some scarring, at the apex. Now, the question is it scarring or is it cancer, which forms in these types of scars? And remember, I have said repeatedly that the CT is a view from 10,000 feet. The CT has essentially no ability to determine whether or not that is a cancer or not. So this patient has some more chest x-rays. It's still there. Eventually, they have another CT scan. In this case, it's in May 2010 now. And it's a little bigger. And this is the image now from May 2010. Now, it turns out that this was not easy to stick a needle in. Ultimately, we need tissue, to decide whether this is cancer or not. But this patient, the radiologist had made the comment that this is not readily accessible by sticking a needle through the chest wall to get through there. And so the patient goes on to have a PET scan without having to have a needle in their chest first, which is the normal way it takes in Ontario to do that. And here's the PET scan, and as you can see on here, this black spot here is in fact almost certainly a cancer. It may not be, there are other things it could be, but there's at least a 95% chance that it's cancer. And not only that it's cancer, that we know from the intensity of uptake from this image that there is some literature that would suggest this means this is a very aggressive cancer with a poor prognosis. Now, the reality is that this probably was a cancer, back in 2009. You can see it's not progressed very much in size. One might have thought it would have grown more than that, but there's a good chance it would have been. If this patient had lived in Quebec or Argentina, Chile, US, Europe, whatever, they would have had that PET scan, following that initial either chest x-ray or CT back in August of 2009. But now that cancer has had a chance to, there's a very good chance, although we don't see any spread on the PET scan elsewhere, but there's a good chance given the time frame that it may have microscopically spread. And so this patient will not do as well. And imagine if we'd have been able to start, the proper therapy on this patient, back in 2009. But sadly, this patient lives in Ontario. Now again, remember that most patients who end up with a chest mass, as I pointed out on other videos, they normally have to have the needle stuck in their chest first. And I pointed out before that there are tremendous risks from that. People collapse their lungs, they bleed into their chest, they actually die from that, from this needle biopsy to get some tissue before you can get a PET scan. And in fact, when you see a chest x-ray and there's a small mass, maybe 2 or 3 centimeter mass on it, it only has about a 30% chance of being malignant. So what the rest of the world does is they then do a PET scan, and if you see a large amount of this sugar uptake in it, then it doesn't mean it's cancer. I'm always relieved that when it's not, because it means it's something else and is probably more treatable than it was if it was cancer. But the point is, if it's now got all this FDG uptake, now the chance is about 90 to 95% that it's going to be cancer, and now it's worth taking higher risk biopsy procedures or getting tissue to now eliminate that. But in Ontario, as opposed to the rest of the world, you've got to stick the needle in the patient's chest first. And this is the government's evidence-based medicine at its best. Basically, remember, they're using evidence-based medicine where they can dial in the answer they want to get the answer they want. Physicians are being forced to practice what I've said before is essentially incompetent malpractice medicine. If you were in Quebec or if you were in the US or wherever else in the world, to stick a needle in a patient's stick the needle in the patient's chest first and put them at all that, typically unnecessary risk. There's a 70% chance that it's not cancer. To put them through all that unnecessary risk, possibly die from this procedure, and not in order to qualify to get a PET scan, is, well, Dr. Aldridger, he said, the process to control and block access to the province borders on immoral. You decide whether this approach is immoral or not. But if you want to change in Ontario, then you need to demand that there are changes, that you need to demand that the government becomes open, transparent, and accountable, and admit what they've done to cancer patients. It's important you do that because it's a travesty. It's beyond comprehension. The world understands what's happening in Ontario, and clearly the press isn't going to touch it, and it's now into our hands that we can do this. We have the power with the internet and social networking to not let up on the government and the Ministry of Health and their various experts, Cancer Care Ontario and so on, until they explain exactly why they have come to conclusions that are the exact opposite of the entire rest of the world using their cherished evidence-based medicine. Thank you.